Hello and good day. This is the Bible Bard. A bard is a storyteller who recites traditional texts in the past associated with a particular oral tradition. And I'm here to recite and to amplify what the literature of the Bible says about who is God and who are human beings. Here's the place we're at today. As listeners of this podcast are aware, in this space we try and avoid the pitfalls of human religious systems. By reading the biblical scriptures, we try to discern who God is, what he is like, what he wants from us, and what the literary text says about humans generally and individually as persons. The Bible Bard doesn't like theological systems because they always leave out or redefine Bible texts or concepts that don't fit into their framework. Instead, the biblical text calls for readers to accept its revelation of who God is and what God is like, and place their faith and trust in this immortal, divine being as revealed by the literature. Even when the text asserts something about God or humanity that may be difficult to accept. Regarding the measure of time in the literature, the text makes distinctions that create God-defined eras during which occur changes in human history and in the relationships defined between God and humanity. We notice this in passages that include limiting temporal strings like the words when, after, until, and then. Sometimes, when speaking of events, the text adds prepositions or prerequisites with language like shall not come, except, or except those days be shortened, other language like that indicates sequence. Other texts may list these chains of sequential events, and like event A precedes event B, which precedes event C. In today's podcast, we're going to look at time limitations the biblical text places on events it describes with a defined terminus, or as something that's yet future. Here's the first era that I think we should notice, and that's from the creation of life on earth in Genesis 2 through 6 to the flood. Now, God is present with humanity, directly communicating to individuals, both morally good individuals and morally bad ones. And he's there in not only just the garden, but after human beings are excluded from the garden, he's there with them, talking to them. And the terminus, though, of this time is a flood that kills all but 8 people in the water. Genesis 7:23 provides that. The next era we look at are where nations are created post-flood. In Genesis 8:20 through 11:26, we see ethnicities generated through Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and their wives. God appears to be less personally present during this era. The terminus of this era. It happens when nations build a tower as a symbol of their unity against God. God's punishment for this act of brazen rebellion is that the people, instead of speaking a single language, suddenly find themselves speaking a multitude of languages. So if you're a bricklayer and you need to talk to the guy who makes the pitch that cements the bricks together, and he suddenly starts speaking a different language, you can't communicate. And you can't ask for more pitch, and he can't ask for more bricks, and the supervisors can't talk to the workers, and the people who get the wood can't understand what the people who get the food are doing. So the people become divided, and in their unity is destroyed, and the nations are thus separated from each other by language. And of course, after the nations are separate, religions and gods proliferate. The next era that we notice just coming from the text, not from a theology, is the time of the patriarchs, and that's begins around Genesis 11:27 to Exodus 1. And here we have these guys, Abraham, his son Isaac, and his son Jacob, and Jacob's 12 sons, become a family which is chosen by God. We have the individual Abraham chosen, and then his family is chosen. Or over time, they become a nation that the text calls the Hebrews. The terminus here is when the family goes down to Egypt to save themselves from starvation. Egypt has food, and the other area they're living in does not. And but gradually, as they live in Egypt, they become enslaved. And it takes this guy Moses to show up and bring them out of Egypt to remove them from slavery. And then he gives them the law of God, and the Hebrew religion is created, and the Hebrew God is announced, and they are different from every other religion in the world. In the next era is the period of the law. Once the law is there and the nation of the Hebrews has agreed to follow it, we have from Exodus 20 to Malachi in the last book of the Old Testament, and the Hebrews become the nation Israel and accept God's law as their national rule. We find that in Exodus 19, verse 8. And then we have this history of alternating failure of the nation and sometimes success in abiding by this national relationship to God. God is present with individuals during bad times and with the nation during times when they observe the law. The terminus here seems to be Matthew 1 to Romans 10. The nation Israel has drifted into outer conformity to the law as culture, but has only a superficial relationship to actual God behind the law. Jesus Christ comes and fulfills the law, the text says, and in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Romans, and Acts, Christianity is created. Now, the next period is the period of the church, and this is from Romans through the book of Revelation, the last book of the Bible in the New Testament. And here, Israel ceases to have a national boundary, and the Jewish people are scattered throughout the world as punishment that God rains down on them for their failure to keep their covenant with Him. The church now comes to succeed while being faithful to the gospel message of the New Testament. But gradually, we see the same thing happening to the church. The church drifts into an outer conformity to the gospel of the New Testament, and now it's the gospel as culture. But it has only a superficial relationship to God. And the terminus here, which is yet future, is the believing church is saved out of the world, while the unbelieving church that has just sort of a Christian culture is destroyed by the unbelieving world that hates even the thought of the church being responsible to a God. And in the chaos of judgment from God, that virtually God destroys all of civilization. And this time, the destruction is not by water, but by fire. The next era that we can discern is the kingdom. And this is parts of the Old Testament and parts of the New Testament that discuss this. An Old Testament example, Zechariah 14, 9 through 16. God reigns over all the earth, the text says. And Revelation 20, verse 1 through 6. There's 1,000 years to this reign that is described. So we have something that the Jews would call messianic rule on earth. Israel is again a nation, and they've already begun that, but in unbelief. But this time, they change, and there's true national correspondence to the Bible's God. The believing church also is there with authority in the Gentile world, which begins And this whole civilization of this 1,000 years begins in fervent belief in the Bible's God. The terminus, also yet future, is after a 10-generation period of 1,000 years, the citizens of both the Jewish nation to some extent and the other nations have drifted away from the Bible-centric worship of God, and paganism reemerges. And there's a final rebellion where the nations of the world in this 10th generation of people rebel against God, attempt to destroy his rule on earth, and then God stops the whole thing. And we suddenly have the earth rolled up, the heavens rolled up like a scroll, and the last judgment that the Bible has spoken of many times occurs. And we see that depicted very clearly in Revelation 20, verses 7 through 10. Now, these defined ages that I've listed above are obvious big changes in how the literature of the Bible covers the period of time within its own structure. There are some people come up with more periods, some with less periods or subdivisions of any particular period. Eons could be and have been defined by various Bible teachers, denominations, and scholarly institutions. Discussion. Bible teachers and church denominations across the centuries have attempted to discover Bible eras and time limitations in the text and have created various hermeneutical and historical frameworks for biblical interpretation. They're allowing what is said about God and what is said about people to be affected by these eras that we've discussed. In accordance with our methodology, the Bible Bard admits that the Bible does contain time-limiting factors which can be marked off as eras. But defining these eras is an exercise in human ingenuity, often interpreting the text according to predefined ideologies, and we don't want to do that. There is even a quasi-denominational, mainly in the USA, denominational emphasis on eschatology, which means the interpretation of future events from prophetic passages that can be identified in the Bible. And we call these people the dispensationalists, which treat defined eras of the Bible as historical sequences. And this unifies their entire historical understanding of the biblical text and the Bible story. This idea contrasts with 2,000 years of naive Bible thinking in which the church imagined that the Christian church would remain faithful to God, gradually spread the gospel to the nations until the entire human world became believers in Jesus Christ. Then Jesus Christ would return from heaven when the last person believed, and we would all live happily ever after for eternity. That's been the idea until dispensationalists came along. The Bible Bard finds some interpretive assertions are well argued, others less so. According to our policy derived from Romans 14, verses 1 through 5, it says, quote, "Except the one whose faith is weak, without quarreling over disputable matters. One person considers one day more sacred than another. Another considers every day alike. Each of them should be fully convinced in their own mind." That's from the NIV. Biblical analysis of end times, like the millennium and postmillennialism and dispensationalism, among others, are disputable matters that are not essential to belief in Jesus Christ and living a life pleasing to God. You can see 1 Corinthians 15, verses 1 through 4, where the essentials are described. Summary. Nevertheless, we think we are living in the time an angel described to Daniel. In chapter 12, verse 8 through 10, Daniel is speaking about these visions he's had of history in the future. And he says, quote, "I heard, but did not understand. So I asked, my Lord, what will the outcome of all this be? He, that's the angel, replied, Go your way, Daniel, because the words are rolled up and sealed until the time of the end. None of the wicked will understand, but those who are wise will understand. Perhaps our generation is living near this time of the end, where there is to be, quote, a time of distress such as not happened from the beginning of the nations until then. Daniel 12:1. Other generations, of course, of believers have fought. Various wars and calamities have fulfilled this description of the time of distress. World War I shocked the Western world and Christianity. World War II was even worse and ended with atomic weapons being exploded. And this, in addition, there continue moral degeneration and violence and all the continued devastations that Jesus predicted in Matthew 24 keep on getting worse, and yet the end has not arrived. Critics mock the fact that each believing generation thinks that theirs must be the last. Critics imagine that the passage of time alone disproves biblical prophecy because they say, where is the promise of his coming? The text of the Bible deals with these objections. See 2 Peter 3, verses 4 through 5. But believers know that the Bible's God is an eternal being who's not in a hurry. Yet when he does act, everything he predicted suddenly falls perfectly into place. Conclusion. This is the way the Bible Bard works. Brief recitations are closely focused, no distractions, no rabbit trails. We're talking about what the literature of the Bible states, the ideas and concepts it presents, because most people have never engaged with biblical thought. Make up your own mind whether you agree or disagree with the Bible's pronouncements. Go to www.biblebard.org to download a transcript, listen to another episode from the archive, or get links to other materials and information. You can support the Bible Bard podcast on Patreon if you search for Bible Bard USA. As little as $1 a week or $5 a month helps cover the costs of the podcast. You can also give it GoFundMe or at the website donate tab. Click that tab and then make a contribution. Send the Bible Bard any questions or remarks you care to offer to BibleBardUS@gmail.com. Glad to hear from you. And you know how this works. Thanks in advance for following, subscribing, sharing, and commenting on the Bible Bard content from our many platforms, both audio platforms and video platforms. And remember, the Bible Bard is available in translated form in Urdu, Chigua, Swahili, Hindi, Spanish, Nepali, and we're working on other languages. So go to the podcast website, and until next time, this is the Bible Bard.